Welcome to Agitate Organise Saturday. This is a collaboration between Don't Leave Organise and Socialist Telly. We've featured a huge number of campaigns and organisations and issues on this programme, but I think a few of them really are as totemic of this Tory government's contempt for ordinary people as the Grenfell tragedy. Kathy, before we go on to the two wonderful guests we've got on this week's programme, have you got any initial thoughts on this before we hear from them?
So before we go to our guests, it's really important to remember a development this week, an announcement from Robert Jenrick. All of the cladding that has been categorised as unsafe, he has said is fundamentally safe.
It's once again, it's collectivising risk and privatising profit. And we see that again and again and again. Let's go to our guests. On the 14th of June 2017, after decades of austerity, deregulation and cuts to vital services, the catastrophe that the Grenfell Action Group had long warned of tragically occurred. A fire in a flat in the 24-storey tall Grenfell tower block spread to flammable cladding that covered the building, leading to the deaths of 72 people. Matt Rack, who wrote in the Tribune on the 3-year anniversary of the Grenfell tragedy, in a piece titled "Grenfell, a Very Capitalist Tragedy," said, "The local state and its agents, for whom public safety should have been a crucial consideration, were driven overwhelmingly by the need to cut costs. Those involved in the design and construction cut corners and made decisions based on the appearance and cost, not suitability and safety." Now, we all know what the tragic and horrific result of that was. And this evening, my first guest is John Wharnsby, who is the North East Area Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union and the London Grenfell Community Rep. And he's here to talk to me about the issues around this tragedy. John, thank you for making the time to speak to me.
Thanks for having me.
So, look, jumping straight in, how significant a role do you think the years of deregulation and austerity played in the Grenfell tragedy?
I don't think we really understood the depth of what austerity played into the tragedy until sort of phase 2 of the Grenfell inquiry, where it's kind of been made apparent to both myself, firefighters, and the FBU and the wider public that just actually how badly the TMO and our BKC performed and how much their decisions were made based on cost. Just very recently, the head of health and safety has spoken quite passionately about her overwhelming workload and the fact that it was just a culture within the TMO and within the council not to request any more funds or not to ask for any more people to do the work or to employ someone else. And she's spoken quite passionately about how overwhelmed she was. So it just shows that the culture of cost cutting has a real effect on health and safety. And I know health and safety gets a bad rap and red tape, etc., but it genuinely is what keeps us safe. And that's sort of played out with this tragedy. So it's played a huge part, I think, in listening to the inquiry, what's come on since that. It just shows how big a part the cuts to the services and basically cuts to services for people has played. And if you listen to the Grenfell Tower inquiry, if you listen to the BBC podcast, which is an excellent overview of Friday of what's gone on in the weeks, they do summarise things for people that can't watch the inquiry day in and day out. And it, from the caretakers that were walking around doing the checks on the ground to the head of health and safety for Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, and for the TMO, each one of them mentioned the fact that their workload was too high and they couldn't actually perform the task that the health and safety law required of them. So it's a huge tragedy, and it's a huge tragedy that's basically come from austerity and cuts to our services.
And that means, obviously, there's nothing kind of particularly. I mean, obviously, it's a horrific tragedy that very luckily very luckily hasn't happened again. But I think we've come close a couple of times, haven't we? But I think it's important. I mean, because of the underlying conditions, there's nothing particularly unique about Grenfell Tower. There are dozens of towers around the country in a similar state.
There's a lot of people still living in towers clad in exactly the same cladding that was on Grenfell Tower. We don't know from these buildings whether the background of the poor building work, poor installation, and all the other things that contributed to the fire. We don't know whether they're the same on those blocks. We might never know. But yeah, the fact of the matter is this cladding remains on buildings, and the fact that it got there in the first place is the real story. I think it's the fact that it's there is what we're talking about now, and the fact that we're trying to get it off. If you follow people like hashtag the cladding scandal and groups like that that are campaigning that they don't bear the costs from these companies, really and truly, the real story is how we got there in the first place and how we ended up to have thousands of blocks all over the country, very many of them in London, with people living in them that's got this cladding on it. And that's the real story. And I think that's the bit that we need to find out, because there are other places in society, it may not be a cladding scandal, it may not be something else, but there's somewhere else where there's a cut that has risked health and safety that we don't know about yet. It may not be in the fire service, it may be in the police service, ambulance service, somewhere. It may not even be in blue light services, it may be in social care, it may be somewhere else, but there is somewhere else in society where austerity and cuts have caused a hole, and we don't know about it yet, because we didn't, on the 13th of June 2017, we didn't know that there was a cladding scandal, we didn't know the full depth of how cuts had affected people, but there is something else out there, and that's the problem with austerity, and that's the problem with cuts. It's a bit of a false economy as well, because if you look at the cost, and there is no cost to people's lives, there is no way that you can measure people's lives in monetary terms. However, if you just look at the costs associated with Grenfell Tower, the refurbishment works have been completely blown away by the cost of the inquiry and by the cost of taking this cladding off buildings. So it's a false economy, and unfortunately, it's a Lib Dem Tory economy where they cut everything to the bone. But those cuts have a life cost, but they also have a monetary cost. And that gets picked up in all different places and in all different services, cuts to social care, for instance. They then pop up in the police force, where the police force are having to deal with a lot of people with mental health issues, etc., because they're not being cared for in the community. So it's basically a false economy, I feel, that most of the cuts. I think we can... it's better off to invest early and invest in people, and I think that way we save money in the long term.
And that's such an important point. I mean, obviously, you talk about austerity and cuts, but also the role of deregulation in this, because those cuts create a blind spot, and then that deregulation just rams through really dangerous stuff. And I think when you talk about the false economy, I think there's parallels, isn't there, with what's happening with climate change. I mean, there was a piece of research came out just the other day. They're saying just in the Clyde Valley, so Glasgow area, it'll cost $2 billion to protect communities from the effects of climate change. What's happening in Portland at the moment? I mean, roads are collapsing because it's too hot. I mean, this is kind of almost, the relationship between austerity and deregulation. We're going to see more and more of this stuff, aren't we?
And obviously, this is we have our allegiances to certain parties, and austerity is a Lib Dem Tory project, which I think has failed massively. But the deregulation was a Labour government. It was a 2006 Labour government regulatory reform order, which ripped up the Fire Service Act and basically was deregulation. So I think there's not only things for us to learn as people, it's not only things for us to learn as a country, but our own party. There are lessons that we can learn from following it's always seen as a business friendly sort of approach where we sort of deregulate and stuff. I don't actually think it's business friendly, because I just do think that the cost is just passed down the line to someone else. However, but there is a lesson to be learned here for our own party, where that regulatory reform order has a huge part to play in not only Grenfell, but other tragedies where the emphasis was put on the responsible person of the building. I know there's a legal argument going on between RBKC and the TMO on who was ultimately the responsible person. The responsible person for a building under regulatory reform order, the emphasis was put from fire service overseeing these things to basically it being the responsibility of the person that owns the building, and it was this offset of costs. So the cost is now on the responsible person, not the fire service or any sort of overseeing body. And again, it's given down to, we see from the fire risk assessments that were written up by his own input into the inquiry. The fire risk assessor was basically one of the cheapest options, was given the job because there was no real oversight on how we got those jobs. And the TMO are quoted as saying they wanted someone who was more happy to challenge the fire service. So as if the fire service is there to be challenged, we're there to keep people safe and to make sure that the responsible people are abiding by the law. And if anyone follows the inquiry, there was several notices given by the London Fire Brigade to the TMO that they were not abiding by the statutory law that they're supposed to when it comes to fire safety. So these things are kind of wide-ranging, but I do think there's lessons to be learned not only from austerity but also our own policies if we're going to be a government in waiting in the future. I think we need to really have a good think about how we move forward when we're sort of changing the law.
Really important point, Sam. You did touch on the inquiry there. I mean, I wonder if you could. I mean, obviously, it was a long process, and it was slightly interrupted by COVID and all the rest of it. I wonder if you could just sort of talk us through the government's response and what's been happening with the inquiry.
It doesn't really seem to have been a response by the government. There's been a lot of rhetoric around it. So from Theresa May 2 years ago, promising that they'll do everything to keep people safe in their homes. On the second-year anniversary to Boris Johnson's comments about how leaseholders shouldn't bear the cost of any remedial work that's been done, which again both of them it's just been rhetoric really. There's no real action by the government. Their opportunity
promise on leaseholders. I mean, that was broken as it was uttered, wasn't it? I mean, they knew that was nonsense. And just weeks later, they were offering ridiculous loans that people couldn't afford for living in death traps through no fault of their own.
So when I do talk about this, I tend to sort of draw a comparison to the car industry, for instance. If we had a fault on a car that killed 72 people, for instance, and was likely to kill more people if it happened again, those cars would be recalled. They would be fixed, and it wouldn't cost the people that bought those cars a dime. It just seems to me that just because they're homes, it's treated slightly differently. And people are facing hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of £100,000 of bills just to make sure that their homes are safe. And they didn't ask for this cladding. They had no say in what went on here. They just expected the people that were putting it on to be responsible. And maybe it's in the word unaffordable. Maybe Boris Johnson doesn't think that £100,000 is unaffordable because he gets that for a evening standard column. But for most people, the normal people, it's chicken feed. Yes, he has referred to that sort of money as chicken feed. It's not chicken feed to people. That's life-changing money. That these people shouldn't be done. But my problem is I don't think the taxpayer should pay for it either. There's an issue here where we have people who put the cladding on are also the companies that are being asked to take the cladding off and put new cladding on. So it's almost a win-win situation for people in that industry. We've got firms selling off their shares recently for millions of pounds and flying off and living wherever they want to live in the world when people are faced with these bills. So we do have to ask ourselves, did the government do enough to actually make the industry that is at fault pay for the remedial works that are being done? And once again, when we talk about austerity, we talk about cuts, we talk about deregulation. The company that was privatised, the public company that was privatised, that was supposed to test this cladding, that was privatised. So therefore, the company that is supposed to be testing this cladding, holding these firms to account, they then become their clients. So it's this weird sort of hand in gloving hand sort of relationship between people that I find extremely uncomfortable. There's a lot of nostalgia around, especially with Brexit and other stuff. People love a bit of nostalgia. They love looking back to like the old days, etc. We had British standards. These companies weren't privatised. They were British institutions, and they held businesses, they held building firms, they held all of these people to account. And if you're going to have any else nostalgia, have it about the stuff that actually you should be nostalgic about. The worrying thing is, and the real tragedy is, Grenfell Tower, when it was built in the 60s, was safer than it was when it was refurbished in 2017. Now that shouldn't happen. It's like 50 years old. It shouldn't happen. And one of the things I do always point out to people is that isn't the Grenfell Tower fire. Grenfell Tower had a number of fires in its history, each one of them limited to the flat, possibly broke out into the lobby area, but was extinguished by the London Fire Brigade. And that is repeated in high-rise buildings all over the country. Myself as an operational firefighter, I've been to quite a few high-rise fires in 1960s, 70s blocks, 1950s, 60s blocks. Grew up in the shadow of one, saw burnt out big windows growing up. All of those fires occurred in those flats, stayed within those flats because they were built. These buildings were built with compartmentalisation in their design, and the idea that the fire would be held in that flat for a period of time so that firefighters can come and put out the fire. Now, that's repeated in thousands of blocks all over the country and undermined by the remedial works that are done on them. So when people say it's the Grenfell Tower fire, it's not. It's just the first fire that occurred after refurbishments.
So before we talk a bit about what happens next, what people watching can do, how they can we've drawn some parallels with some of the sort of climate change stuff, but I think the big parallel that needs to be and I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but obviously we've just gone through this COVID crisis, same government, same duty of care. And I would argue same complete failure in that duty. You know, you look at, they looked at profit instead of people, didn't they, when they were handing out PPE contracts to people that had no ability to produce it. There's been a people's COVID inquiry set up because there was very little trust in the government's own ability to do an inquiry, to check its own homework, as it were. Do you think do you think there are parallels between the government that's responsible for governments for creating the conditions that allowed a tragedy like Grenfell to occur and the government's handling of COVID?
There are some comparisons to be made with the pandemic response, but I think more the pandemic actually highlighted again the problems with austerity rather than any sort of comparison with you've got overworked NHS staff. You've got firefighters going to help the NHS drive ambulances and stuff. I was one of those that volunteered myself. And I just think it showed how not investing in our public services leaves us vulnerable. So I don't know if there's comparisons in the fact of how they've occurred, but definitely the result of them, the more people dying, the not having enough bed space, not having the nurses. So I think, again, what we're talking about, investing in people and investing in the public, investing in society in general, I think, again, there's a money saver there. If you have the capacity in the system, in healthcare, in policing, then you have the ability to save money in the future. The ambulance service was stretched beyond its capabilities. And the police service was really, really stretched after 50,000 police officers posts have been cut. And now we've got stories going on about, we'll put 20,000 back in. No, it was still 30,000 down. And that's a workload on top of those police officers, on top of firefighters. Grenfell tragedy happened in London, one of the biggest metropolitan brigades. There's a lot of fire engines there. Fire engines that exist in London, some counties or some FRSs around the country don't even have that many fire engines. So it happened in London. There was 60 machines, command units, and other sort of specialist machines. That's more than some brigades have because of the austerity and the cuts that have happened around the country. It's only that happened in a big metropolitan brigade that there was that many fire engines to actually send them. But yeah, so pandemic response, absolutely comparisons, more in the effect of how it has affected the country and how we haven't come out of it yet. But I also think there's an ideology here where they were very, very reluctant to shut the country down. They were very, very reluctant to shut it down the second time. And again, like austerity, if you invest in, or if it's a stitch and time saves nine, if you invest in people and services, yes, you spend a bit of money, but you have some resilience in the system.
So, John, thank you so much for really important insights there, and thank you for all your public service. I guess my last question is, so people watching this, what can they do if they want to make a difference, if they want to stop other Grenfells? How can they help out? What can they do?
Yeah, so one of the things I would ask people to do is support their local fire service and make sure that there is a white paper coming out that the government have started, which on the scheme of it will be some sort of modernisation of the fire service. But what we know is that they intend to have PCCs instead of chief officers in many brigades. And the idea of that is that they have overall control of the fire service. They want to get rid of our national bargains. There's an attack on the NJC coming. This will all be dressed up by the government as modernisation of the fire service, or these things that the fire service needs to do better. One of those will be negotiation with the union, and that needs to change. However, from my own personal experience and the pandemic response, I know that the Fire Brigades Union were instrumental in ensuring that firefighters went out and helped other agencies in a safe way, had the PPE, made sure that we did it, and that made people more confident in going, made firefighters like myself more confident in going forward and helping out. There will be an attack by government on the fire service, and it will be dressed up, as they have been in the past, as modernisation. But as we've spoken quite at length today, modernisation or reform or whatever, it has a downside. And so please support local fire services when it comes up to when there will be campaigns against any government attacks. Please just make sure that you support the FBU and support your local firefighters.
And listen, when that campaign really ramps up, we would love to have yourself and your comrades in the FBU on this programme again to talk specifically about that campaign.
You're welcome to. I'd encourage anyone out there that's interested in helping out is to hashtag Cladding Scandal, for instance. There's many groups out there that are fighting to not face the bills of the remedial costs. Follow groups like Justice for Grenfell, Grenfell United, support them online. There tends to be marches once we're out of the pandemic. Please join a protest, but stay angry. That's the thing. It's very, very difficult at this point. In phase 2 of the inquiry, it's taken a long, long time to come through, and it's still not concluded. It's still got a couple of years to go. And every revelation that comes out from the Grenfell Tower inquiry is absolutely disgusting. It's awful and it's blood-curdling. But it's hard to stay angry all the time. But what I would say is don't let apathy and don't let that become the bar, because each one of these things that's happened, that's been revealed by the inquiry, should be a headline in itself. So I encourage people to just keep following the inquiry, keep staying angry, stay onto your MPs, please write letters. If there's marches, please join them. We need people, we need some solidarity. Follow the FBU's campaign, Grenfell Never Again, in conjunction with Daily Mirror. But please just stay angry, because it's really sad for, I know, the community, and to try to keep people focused on this tragedy when there's so much going on, pandemic tragedy as well. Stay angry about that. But I'm concerned that with every revelation, that becomes the norm. So it's difficult to then raise the bar above that. But each single one of these revelations should be devastating for the public in general, for us looking after one another. Each one should be just a groundbreaker. Every time I hear something, it's like, that's the one that we should change everything. Everyone's going to see it now. And it doesn't. And then one after the other. So please, just encourage people to stay angry, stay involved, speak to your MPs, bring questions up at Labour meetings, bring questions up at your community meetings. Just don't let this go away. And please support the people that are trapped in these flats, because they're the next tragedy, unfortunately, waiting to happen. And it's not just a tragedy of health and safety. It's a tragedy of their lives, because it's life-changing money that these people are going to lose. So please just be supportive of one another, look after one another, and just show some solidarity across our movement.
So really important words there from John. We'll put links to all of this stuff in the description. If you're watching on Twitter or Facebook, do go over to our YouTube, because there's a much bigger description section. We'll put links in. You can click on, put your postcode in. You can write to your MP, your councillors, all the rest of it straight away. We'll also put links into all those campaigns and all that other important information that John just talked about. John, thank you again for everything you do, and thank you for your time this evening.
No worries. Thanks very much for having me.
My next guest is Liana Oliffe with the Grenfell Community Campaigners. Liana, thank you so much for making the time to speak to us. I'm really interested to understand. Obviously, there's lots of groups that have formed to campaign for Grenfell residents and for the issues that have come out of that. I'm thinking of the cladding campaigns, and obviously existing organisations like the FBU, who we've just spoken to, have been great campaigners as well. I'd be really fascinated to find out how you went about building the Grenfell Community Campaigners and how you see its role in that mix.
Okay. Well, initially we formed because with the COVID pandemic, Grenfell was very much not at the forefront of news anymore. And it was almost like we were being forgotten. I am a North Kensington community member. Like everybody, knew people who have passed in the tower. Used to, many years ago, live in Upper Grenfell Walk, so directly opposite the tower, so have strong links on the estate. I'm literally only 5-6 minutes away from it, where I am now, still in North Kensington. And like everybody, was horrifically impacted and still suffering trauma and grief and outrage at what happened that night. And starting to follow the inquiry, it became very clear that the levels of negligence went way beyond where we originally thought. I mean, we knew straight away from the way that, having watched it in person, the way the tower burned, that there was clear issues to do with the insulation and the cladding, which, as far away as I am, I'm about 2 miles away up the road. Well, probably not even that. It's about 1.5 miles up the road from the tower. There was cladding in my garden. There was cladding in the park. It was flying because the winds were quite powerful that morning as well, of the 14th. And so we knew straight away there were issues with that. But I think originally the community, their anger was very much at RBKC and KCTMO, the RBKC, Walborough of Kensington Chelsea, and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, who RBKC had put in to manage all the council stock for them. And there were immediately all the old blogs from the Grenfell Action Group, the GAG group, were coming up and highlighting the fact that TMO and the council had been informed over and over that there were issues. But the longer that the inquiry went on, the levels of contempt towards residents, of total disregard, of inhumanity, really, towards people and their lives and their safety was growing. And then the pandemic hit and Grenfell went quiet. It wasn't in the news. COVID and the pandemic dominated everything. And we were getting very frustrated. Me and a close group of friends were getting very frustrated at the fact that, can we not forget about Grenfell, please? Because this is a major issue. And so I literally put a call out on Facebook and I said, I've had enough. This is beyond ridiculous. Who's up for coming to protest outside the inquiry? And initially, I think it was only about 4 people responded, but we went down anyway. Then initially we went there every other day. It was too much to go every day. So we tend to do a Monday, Wednesday and a Thursday because they don't sit on a Friday. And for about 3-4 weeks, it was sometimes just two of us who've been there steadfast throughout. And I kept putting out flyers, which have got slightly better as time goes on. We're almost a year up now from the campaign having started. And we were just a group of locals who were frustrated at the lack of attention that Grenfell was getting in the media and in general, definitely with the government. So the flyers started to get attention. I covered the Twitter, Facebook groups, because there's, as you said, there are lots and lots of Grenfell groups that were initiated in the wake of the fire. So I flooded those. I flooded Instagram with the flyers, and slowly but surely, numbers began to grow. And as we started to get more, especially if it was somebody major coming up, such as Celotex or Kingspan or Arconic, or when KCTMO individuals were there, of which I'm a council tenant myself, so I've had lots of experience with some of the people that have been there. And then obviously RBKC officers. I'd started to develop contacts with the press. Initially, there was 3 of us who were completely disabled. And then Moira, who I'd supported a lot whilst she was with Justice for Grenfell, but she'd left them about 1.5 years ago. And she joined along with us. And when she came, she brought along Homes for All, who are a national organisation. Overall, we can get anything up to sort of 35 people turn up, which during the pandemic, we didn't really want more than that because it's quite big outside, so we can distance, but we didn't want to become so massive that we ended up getting shut down. It was more important that we could be there. So we then reached out to some of the cladding groups. So End Our Cladding Scandal, I think the Manchester Gladiators, and several other groups. And so we kind of support them and retweet stuff that they've put out there, and we retweet for them. And it also became part of our campaign. So we've kind of made all our banners ourselves. We're totally not funded. We're not a proper organisation, registered organisation or anything. We're just locals, and then some supporters from South London actually who come along, and from Westminster.
So you started just literally a handful of people online who were really worried that this was, sliding out of the public consciousness, and you took a stand and you started campaigning, you started networking with those other groups. What would you say have been the most kind of important key lessons of the last year or so of this particular campaign?
Plan together, and that's really important to make sure that. I think it's important to make sure everyone has a voice. And I think that's why people keep joining, because a lot of organisations fall into the trap of they've got to have leaders, and then those leaders take control and other people lose their voices. And I think what's been important for us is that everybody has a voice, everybody has an input, but also as quickly as you can, develop links with other groups. Corporate greed kills. Because we have the evidence here, 72 people. Blacknell House had 6, and the government refuses to act, even though they're paying billions for this inquiry. Phase 1 came up with some very, very strong recommendations, and they've not pushed those through at all. We're 4 years on and still nothing. And houses and flats and hospitals and schools all around the country are covered in these lethal materials.
People watching this programme, hopefully inspired by the amazing campaigning that you've been doing, how can they get involved? How can they help you? What's your ask of them?
First of all, follow Grenfell United, absolutely. And people like Phil Murphy, follow Phil Murphy on Twitter. He's a fire expert. Peter Apps, who does the daily report from the inquiry. Follow the inquiry. it's affecting everyone. The levels of deregulation are affecting everyone. And it's only by watching the inquiry, listening to what comes out of it, reading everything that I can about the building and fire regulation flaws, massive flaws that you get to find out and ask questions. Like, one of the things we did was, there's a brand new school, special needs school, that's what's more disgusting, being built round the corner, so in North Kensington. And my fellow campaigner who was with me from day one, she happened to be cycling past and noticed outside Kingspan insulation material in the yard of the building site of the school, and rang me in a terrible state, because things like this for us are really triggering, because we know that Kingspan was partially responsible for the loss of 72 wonderful lives, 18 of whom were children and one unborn. And she came to me and I said, right, that's it. We're going to get a protest done and we're going to be there Monday morning. So we were there at 8 o'clock in the morning on the Monday. She'd spotted it on the Saturday. The council came down. We shut the site down. We had lots of our local Labour ward councillors came down and supported us as well. I'd advertised it again with one of my flyers everywhere and let people know. And so we had lots of community members and parents from the school come down. And we managed to get the insulation that hadn't been removed from the school, hadn't been used, removed from the school that day. And we're still fighting with the council because apparently it's been installed under the flooring as a damp-proof material, along with rock wool, which isn't flammable, but the Kingspan green card is 100% flammable. It's more flammable than the material that was put on Grenfell, not to mention toxic. So it's about really making sure you find out what your rights are, what materials are being used, especially if you're buying a new property. What's in there? Are you going to be safe? Because landlords don't care, developers don't care. For them, it's all about the money. For us, it's about safety. So I would beg everybody, please keep yourself aware of what is going on in the building industry. What is safe? It might meet regulations at the moment, but when we win our fight, and it's not just our fight, obviously this is Grenfell United's fight, this is the Cladding Group's fight, this is everybody's fight really, to get the deregulation put back to being tight and protecting people. Keep yourselves aware, because most people go innocently into things and you can end up making a huge mistake, which has ended in suicides. People have committed suicide because they've lost everything. They're in a valueless home and they've lost everything. This is really key. So follow Grenfell United, follow the inquiry, keep up to date with what's happening as far as the building and fire regulations are concerned.
Hugely important points there. And as always, we'll put links to all of these things in the description. Liana, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for putting into this hugely important issue, and best of luck with everything.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. Cheers, Matt.
Really important to hear from those two guests. Obviously, the FBU, of course. John, really great guest for the programme, but also, obviously, this is about campaigning and campaigners. So really, really privileged to hear from Liana and all the work that she's doing in the community and for the community. I think we should talk about the campaigning aspect of it. But first, I mean, it really needs to be stated, doesn't it, Kathy? The Tories want you to think this is an isolated tragedy, that it's just something that, it's just a horrible thing that happened. But it's not, is it? Fundamentally, this is a direct result of a chain of failures, but also decisions by this and other governments to deregulate. When they say we want to cut red tape, this is what it means.
Yes, absolutely that. So this was a completely predictable outcome of Tory policy. They don't describe their policy this way in a manifesto, but we know it's about utter contempt for the many, devastating cuts to all our public services. This was a very diverse community, so the hostile environment and racism play their part in this tragedy and in potential similar tragedies elsewhere, because we know what this government thinks about minorities. Johnson expresses that constantly. And, this is an outcome of general contempt for us, but specific contempt for minorities.
And I think as well, it typifies, doesn't it, this government, if it thinks it can get away with something, if it thinks the public is less interested in a certain community, then it will do all sorts of harm. I mean, we've seen it, haven't we, with the police and crime bill, with the traveller communities, as you say, the hostile environment and all the rest of it. I was really glad that we had Liana on. I think really goes to show that you don't need a giant organisation behind you to set up a campaign, do you? You don't need someone to give you permission. I think we had Mike Jackson on the programme right back when we started out, and he was saying, get one other person, and that's what you can't do it on your own, but get one other person, and you can really start to do stuff. And it was really great to hear from her, wasn't it?
Oh, it was fantastic. And another great campaigner around Grenfell is Moira Samuels. Moira couldn't be with us, but sends her solidarity and is a wonderful speaker on this issue from the real grassroots community work. We must keep awareness going on this issue. I know that people have not been going to the silent walks. Obviously, during lockdown, we've changed how that is all happening. But real solidarity to places like Milton Keynes, like Liverpool, many, many other places. I'm sorry, I won't list them all. But there are areas in the country that every month on the day do something big to remember Grenfell. And we should all be lobbying for that to happen locally. The whole country should be lit up green, but not in the same way as go out on a Thursday and clap for the NHS, not in that superficial manner, but just to really make sure people understand that why this happened and it can happen again.
I think in some ways we're lucky it hasn't. But you're absolutely right. We, never forget, fundamentally.
That's exactly it.
Every community in this country has a potential Grenfell in it.
Yeah.
And there hasn't been a just resolution for victims of Grenfell or for the potential victims in the future. And that's what we've got to fight for.
Yeah.
Kathy, do you have any final thoughts this week?
Well, it is really to support the grassroots campaign, listen to what they're asking us to do. Every month on the anniversary, do something. And also, as far as we can, through our local CLPs, support the FBU, our firefighting heroes who are not only part of the scapegoating around Grenfell, the first part of the inquiry certainly attempted to do that pernicious thing, but also they are going through all sorts of other attacks around collective bargaining, etc. They're a fantastic campaigning union around many, many things, fundamental to Grenfell, but also climate change. We must support our firefighters.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. And Liana asked me to say, she did reference GU in that interview. She was referring to Grenfell United, but of course there are other organisations involved with this struggle, with this campaign, so support those as well. As Kathy said, we've really got to stand up for the FBU. The Tories will come after them, as we've seen in the past. Keep talking about this. Don't forget about this. As Liana said, educate yourself about these issues, because it's not just high rises, it's schools, it's all sorts of other things. Most importantly, do not go gentle. It's that good night. Watch Educate, Agitate, Organise every Saturday night. Thank you for watching.